In this video, we'll take a look at making a mountain valley terrain in Gaea as shown here. We'll also take a look at how we can export this terrain to Unreal as a height map. We'll start off with a blank network, and we'll be creating the larger shapes or the structures of our mountain first. And to do that, I'll start off with a canyon node to create a bit of kind of like a valley for our mountain to get added into. And right now, by default, it's pretty steep and pretty sharp of a canyon. And we'll adjust this by changing some settings here. So instead of canyon structure, I'll go to collapse. Instead of simple, I'll go to granular. And I'll start playing with the scale, maybe something like 65, or maybe a bit smaller, 62%. And then width will make the canyon width much larger. So maybe something like 75 or 76%. And then we can adjust the slot, valley, surrounding, and depth. And really it's all just about kind of eyeballing what works best here. So I'll just kind of play around with these numbers and find something that works. And try to get just some interesting shaping that's not too steep, that's not too extreme. And then maybe play around with the seed a bit to see what we can get. And once I have something that I think looks okay, like maybe this is all right, what I'll end up doing is start building upon this. We can always change this later, but we can always add other nodes and start structuring things a little bit more as well. So right now this looks pretty good, but I want it to be a bit more gradual. So what I'm going to do is add a apex node. So I'm going to go in here and look for apex, which I think will be found. I could also press tab and search it, but it's here under filters. And I'll connect that to our canyon, and I'll press F to preview that or pin that. And that kind of creates this very steep, sharp valley now. And maybe that's a bit too strong, so I'll make the steepness maybe 1%. And now we get something like this. And it seems a bit extreme, but again, we're just building up shapes right now. We're not worrying about small details. And then once I have something like this, I can combine this with maybe our mountain or some other structure. So I'm going to go down and find, or actually, let's see, it's up here, combine node. And I'll combine this with something else that we're going to make, which will be maybe, let's see, if we want something to create some sort of structure, maybe a ridge. So this ridge node gives us some shaping like this, which is interesting, very sharp angular shaping, which might give us some nice structures. So I'll take this ridge node and we can start adjusting, again, scale, height, definition, seed, and just finding something that works. So I can just kind of shuffle around here, find a value that looks kind of interesting, gives us a lot of shape, and then just start playing with these other sliders. So I want something very, very steep or fairly steep. So maybe I'll increase the height. And on top of that, change the scale. Seems like lower scale works better. And then definition, maybe a lot of definition to give us a lot of detail. And if it's not giving you the look that you want, like what I have here is interesting shaping, but it's not really steep or not really that intense, I can go in here to my advanced settings and change this and shuffle it around. Or I can also go down here to this extra drop down and add like a log or equalization or something to make it way more steep and way more intense. And if I do that, also do drop to floor so it makes sure the lowest point matches up with the grid. And then I could maybe even use something like this. Like if we look at this, it's all kind of collapsing in, but I want a mountain kind of pushing out. So maybe this is pretty good shaping, but I just have to invert it. So I can always go here and add a invert node to our ridge. Now it's like mountains pushing up, and then I can combine that with what we had before and start getting some interesting terrain. And based on how we combine that as well, you can change it from right now it's a blend where it's like a 50-50 mix of each input, this first input and this second input. But I can also change it to other blend modes as well, perhaps like max and then 100%. And then it kind of blends those two. And maybe I'm not happy with the shaping, like it's a bit too chaotic. So I'll go back here to canyon and ridge and play around with the seed or the values a bit more. So after making a few more adjustments, I ended up with a shaping like this, which I thought was pretty good. I have this large kind of mountain here, and then this crevice where maybe water could run through. It'll become a bit more flat at some point, and then these other surrounding mountains on the other side. So that's kind of what I'm trying to go for, is like a bit of a kind of V-shaped kind of valley. And to get to this point, I really just went back to my canyon node, started playing around a bit more with the seed and some of these settings here. So the seed I found pretty good to get this shape was 58032. And then same thing for ridge, just playing around with the seed and some of these settings here. And I kind of found this seed here, 38198, that gave me this really large kind of peak here in the center. And then when I combine those two with the max method, I ended up with our valley like this. And it doesn't really matter how you get this shape. It's just shaping the large shapes of our terrain. We're not worrying about details. We're just worrying about the overall shaping of our terrain. From here, we can start adding more details and making the shapes a little bit more recognizable as terrain. But up to this point, we're just trying to get the overall shape, the overall structure that we want. So now that we have this, or something similar to this, we can start doing some final adjustments. So right now it is kind of steep and it is kind of crazy. So maybe what I'll also end up doing is on the combine node here, I'll add a clamp, and I'll clamp the maximum to a little bit lower just so it's not as steep. Maybe I'll clamp it to 85% just to pull it down a bit so it's not as steep. And that should be okay. And then from here, to turn these details into something that has a bit more structure, like a landscape, instead of these really rigid details, I'm going to use a stratify node. So I'm going to go here to Erosion, drag in a stratify node, connect that up, press F to preview it, and you can see what it does to the terrain. It makes it a little bit more recognizable as kind of like mountain rock instead of those really rigid shapes. And I'll probably do some adjustments here, like maybe some more stratification, like 50%. And then style, I guess we're fine with what we have here. And then seed, we could play around with it, but I don't think this will change too much. And then I'll click apply changes for it to update. And I think this is okay. So playing around with the seed a little bit more, I found that 90858 gave me a little bit better shaping on this one side. So I'm going to go with that. And I kind of like what I'm getting here. It's almost like a water, a river or valley can go through here, and then there's like another cut over here as well. So I found that that's working pretty well. Now the next thing that we're going to do is start to add better details to this and kind of start to break up these shapes a bit more. Everything feels a bit wavy and doesn't really look like a proper terrain. So we want to give some more rigid cuts as well, because right now everything's just starting to feel a little bit like kind of melted shapes, and we're losing a little bit of structure. So on top of this stratify, I'm going to add an apex node again and connect that, preview it. It's going to totally break it. But I'm going to change this from distance mode to slant mode, and that kind of shaves off certain angles of the terrain. And then you have an A and B slider here, and I'm going to make those both 20%. It's a little bit more, but it's not going to destroy as much structure. And then we have an angle that we could change, but I'll leave that 0, and I'll turn on mirror edges. And what this is doing is, if we look at it before and then after, is taking some of these edges and just creating these lines or kind of hard cuts. And later on, that will kind of translate to some more rigid slopes. And maybe we could go a little bit further, like we could adjust these numbers a bit more, make them a higher or lower percent, and kind of see how that shaves it off to be even more rigid like that or less. But I think 20% is enough for now. And that'll just give us some nicer cuts on these steeper areas. So after doing that, we'll start trying to add some more details into this. And at the end of adding all these details, we'll add a bit of erosion to kind of simulate the erosion of the terrain, all the water flowing down it, wearing it away. But for now, I'm really just looking at getting a lot of details, a lot of variation. So after this apex node, maybe I'll try something like rugged. So I'll go in here to look dev section and take a rugged node, connect that up. And we'll preview that. We don't really see too much change with that. So maybe what we'll start to do now is take a look at our rugged node here and what we can adjust. So apex, rugged, okay, it does make a difference. And at this point, it might be good to go to 1K resolution just so we could see a bit more detail and see a bit more what these nodes are adding. And that's going to be a little bit better to see. So if we ever stratify, this is what we had. We had that apex, shaves out some of those areas. We add our rugged node, add some more kind of breakup into everything. And I don't really think I need to adjust too much on that rugged node. Maybe I'll go down here and say drop to floor so it pushes our terrain's lowest value or lowest point and matches it up with the grid here, just so it's not floating. And that's not looking too bad. So maybe after this, I think we can break it up a bit more. I'm going to use a shatter. Maybe I'm adding too many nodes here. You might not need really all these. But I like what that shatter does. Definitely adds a lot of breakup into that mountain range here. I'm looking at this kind of triangular shape as the face of the mountain. And when I add that shatter node, I really like what it does there. It adds kind of a lot of breakage, and then you get these areas that feel almost like a rock slide or structures that have like broken apart and fallen down. So I think that's a successful addition. And then we can play around with a bit of its strength. Maybe I push that a bit further, 150%, and collapses half of what it was. Maybe feature scale half of what it was and apply that. And I think that's pretty cool. And then seed you can also play around with, but I'm not going to worry about it. And after that, we can do our erosion. I think we've added enough detail here. I see enough structure and shaping and breakup that I don't really see any point of adding more. It's just becoming almost like noise. So I'm going to add an erosion node and connect this up, our shatter to our erosion. And that will erode everything and create some smoother sloped areas and kind of pull it back a little bit, taper it off. And for our erosion node, we'll probably have to change some of these settings here. So rock softness, maybe I'll put that 50%. Strength, let's pull that back down, maybe 25% or so, and see how that looks. Apply those changes. Okay, it keeps a little bit more of the structure. Down cutting, I don't want any, maybe, because if I have that, it'll start creating too much of these shapes. If you have a lot of down cutting, you'll just kind of turn everything into these kind of mountains with flows, and I'm not really wanting that style. So I'll pull that back. And then maybe some random sedimentation, some random breakup and rocks and some features in these sloped areas. I'll add that to maybe 30%, maybe 35%. See if that does too much. Let's put it to 0. Okay, it adds a little bit. We'll do something like that. And then seed again, you can play around with, change this and apply. Maybe it slightly gives you a better look. But otherwise, don't think there's really too much else I need to adjust there. And if we want to do some final adjustments, I can go down here to these extra options. Maybe I'll do something like a clip. And what we'll do maybe is see if we can If you want to clip out the floor or something, like if you really want to go completely flat and have like lakes or something, you could do like a minimum clip and kind of cut out some areas for water. But actually, we probably don't need that in this case, so maybe I won't use that. And maybe instead I'll try this. We can add a bit of a raise, and we can look here and see if that helps out any areas. So we put that to 0, we get all of our kind of flattened out areas disappearing, and if we pull it up, kind of brings it back. Maybe I'll set that to like 80% or something. And see if we add clip again, actually. Let's see if we add a little bit, like 10%. That flattens it out a bit. I'm really looking at getting areas that are kind of fairly flat in between these valleys, or in between these mountains. And I think clip is helping with that just a little bit. So I'll clip it with maybe 8 or 10% as the minimum, 100% as the maximum. And then we have the raise here with its influence set to 80%. And I think that just pulls it down into a much nicer looking landscape. So this next part might be a little bit unnecessary, but I'm still going to show it because it might be something useful for your own landscapes. And this is where sometimes if I look at terrains, I might want to have areas where water would flow that just have a little bit more erosion. And in that case, what I'll sometimes do is take a flow node. So I'll go in here and scroll down and look for flow under data. I'll connect this erosion to that flow node. And what that's going to do is, if I preview it by pressing F, it'll show me maybe where water would kind of flow and accumulate. And what I'll end up doing is changing the rainfall to 100% and choosing primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary. The higher it is, like quaternary, you'll get smaller structures and more of them. And at this point, it becomes everywhere. And if you do primary, it's just very large structures like this. So I want to keep it to larger structures. We'll do primary and secondary. So something like that. And I'll use that area as a mask to do a bit more erosion. So I'll take another erosion node and I'll erode my original terrain, this one here. So I'll add erosion on top of that again. But I'll use a mask, which will be these flow areas here. So I'll take this flow node, and what I'm going to do with it is I'm going to use it as a mask for this other erosion. And then on this erosion node, I'll preview that. You can see what it's doing. So if we compare this one, we look at these areas. Now it's eroding out those areas. We'll have to change some of the settings. Duration, maybe 1. Rock softness, 100. I'm just going to do strength, 100. And apply. Okay, so there it goes. And we can see before and after. And it kind of flattens out those areas and pushes them up a little bit. But we can adjust it, if we want to adjust other things as well, or if we want to minus away or something, we could invert it. But it's just something that can help you take those areas where water would flow and adjust the shaping a bit more. So you can kind of see those differences. And it's something that's not really necessary, but in some cases it can help you get the shaping that you want. And you could use it as a mask, but you can also use it for removal. So as a mask, it's just adding that original terrain, but with these additional areas that we masked out having more erosion. But I can also connect it up to removal, and it will remove parts from that area. So we go from this to this. So it kind of softens up those areas a bit more where the water would flow. And it might just give us a terrain with less kind of steep angles and maybe artifacts. Like if we look at this area here, before and after, kind of pulls it back down a bit. It might just result in an overall better looking terrain and a bit more subtle details. So that can be useful. You could also use it in this area here, but usually I'm either putting it into mask or removal. And I found that that sometimes can help just pull back your terrains a bit more and make them a bit more usable. Now at this point, we're going to set the resolution to 2K to see how it looks with all its kind of details. So I'll let that generate and then we'll take a look at it. So here's what it looks like at 2K resolution. If we zoom in, quite nice details, looking pretty good. And now at this point, we can start doing some quick coloring on it, even though we might redo a lot of that once we get this into Unreal. It's always nice just to visualize what your terrain looks like with some color, so you can make any final changes now before you get it into Unreal. And sometimes you have to go back and forth and make adjustments. But at this point, I think it'd be good just to preview this with some coloring or some sort of texture on this terrain as well. So after we have this final kind of erosion node here, I'll press G to pin that as our underlay. So G, they'll make it be used for our height. And then we're just going to start adding color on top of this. So to do that, I'm going to go down here to our texture node, wherever it is. I think it's going to be under probably data. There it is, texture. Connect that to our erosion. Press F to preview the texture node on top of our height map. And that's what it gives us. And we can make some adjustments on this texture. Like right now, scale is 15%. Maybe I'll do 3%. Click apply, see what that does. And that will change it a little bit, not much of a difference. So you can make whatever adjustments you want, but honestly, I don't think it's really going to matter for this. It's probably okay. So I'm just going to go right away and connect that texture node to a sat map to take that grayscale coloring and bind a color ramp to it. So for that sat map, I'm going to preview it, press F, and we'll change this to something that might work good for this. Maybe these rocky presets are pretty good. And I'll just scroll through here and see what catches my eye and what might look good. And maybe this 478 is pretty cool, has some green tones in it. I don't see much of those right now, so maybe I'll reverse this sat map and then clamp it and just clip a section of it. Just keep clipping it until I get something interesting. And maybe adjust a bias here to shift it. So really just kind of play around with it. Let's see, negative 40%, 35%. So once we get some kind of detail in here, and maybe I'll clip it right there, it might have a nice variation, and you can just push it a bit further. And to do that, I'm going to turn on this input clarity, and you can also go down to this post processing. And the idea here is I'm going to make this our grass. So I'm just looking for a green, kind of grassy variation over this terrain. So if I want to force it to be a green color, I can go down here and apply hue, saturation, and luminance. And maybe I'll push up the saturation to 2.3 or something. Change the hue. Maybe just nudge it a bit to make it a bit more green. And I can also apply brightness and contrast. And maybe pull down the brightness a bit. Pull it down a bit more. And then up the contrast a bit. You have to be a bit careful with this because you can end up with really weird values that kind of show up strange. But now I have kind of this grassy and muddy tone, which works pretty well. So that's going to be our grass and kind of just dirt. And then what I'll end up doing is doing more rock as well on top of this. So I'll make another network connection here. I'm going to use slope this time and connect that to my erosion and mask out a certain slope. So this will be our grass. This will be our rock up here. For the slope, what kind of angle would I want to mask? Maybe minimum 20 degrees, maximum 15. I'm doing that backwards so we get kind of an inverted value. And then I can up the fall off as well. So I'll change the fall off to something like maybe 45. And now I'm getting all these steep areas kind of masked out. I know the mask is kind of inverted, but that's okay. You could flop these numbers around, but I'm doing this because the next thing I'm going to do is apply a sat map. And I'll connect that sat map to this slope. Press F to preview it. Change that sat map to something that would look like rock. So again, maybe rocky here. And just scroll through here and look for something that's fairly gray, fairly rocky. And let's see, I think around 100 we have some of those. So these are all, maybe it's 172. This one's not bad. 177, maybe that's even better. Okay, that's cool. So we'll go with that and we'll clip this. So maybe don't need all those value ranges there. That's maybe a bit more interesting. Should I reverse it? Maybe. Maybe I prefer those lighter cliffs there. And then we can always play around with our slope a bit more if we want. Maybe change some of these settings. But it's really up to you. So I think this is okay. This is not too bad. I can always fine tune this a bit more, maybe add a little bit of a bias and shift it. But I think this is okay. So now what I'll do is I'll take all this and I'll mix these two together. So we have our rock, we have our grass, our rock. Maybe we'll add one more thing to blend because we'll need to blend these somehow. We have our grass and our rock, but to blend these two, I need a mask to blend it. So to do that, what I'm going to end up doing is adding a couple more nodes. I'm going to use another slope node because I think that's going to be useful. And I'm also going to add another node called protrusion, which will catch some sharp areas that kind of protrude out of the surface. And I'll start off with this protrusion node. We're going to view it, see what it looks like. And I'll give that a minute to generate. And with this protrusion node, you can see it's capturing these little sharp peaks of these rock structures or of these valleys and cliffs. And we can change this to have just really more power or less, but I think this is okay, but I just want to make it like a really strong mask. So I'll go down here and what I'll maybe do is turn on log, turn on equalize, and just make it a really strong mask. Maybe I'll do a clip as well. And also shaper. And just see how it can adjust this. So if I add more strength on the shaper, maybe I'll do drop to floor. See if that makes a difference. Not too much. So I think this might be okay. It's super strong. We only have some areas that aren't kind of captured, these lower areas. Which might be okay, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this and I'm going to use it as a mask for the slope. So when I look at the slope node now, we can define a slope and I'll make the maximum 7% slope. Maybe fall off 15. Something like this. So that's all our grassy areas and it gives us some breakup. I might not really need this protrusion node, like if we disconnect it, but then we lose some details here on the flat areas and having some breakup in there, like having some shapes like that will create little rocks and cliff structures, which might look a bit more interesting. So I'll often mix nodes like this with a mask of another thing like protrusion or something just to get more of those details in there. You don't really see it when looking at the protrusion node. I guess you do a little bit, but when you mix it with the slope, then you just get an overall more complex mask. But again, maybe not necessarily needed. But now I think we have enough stuff to combine this all. So we have our rock, our grass, our mask. We use a combine. There we go. Combine those two sat maps with this slope as our mask. And we'll make it blend 100%. Press F to preview it. That's kind of what we have right now. It's not bad, might need a little bit of adjustment. I can see this rock is going too far. So maybe I'll go back here and look at our mask here for slope and maybe adjust it a bit and see what we can do to make that a bit more interesting. Maybe on the slope node here, what we'll end up doing is add a log and then equalize and preview that. I'll make the grass go a bit further up. It's maybe a little bit better. Maybe we make that fall off a bit more. 18. So it goes a bit further up the mountain. And looking at protrusion down here, I think that's all fine. I don't really like how these mountains are looking, so maybe I'll go back to the rock, the rockiness. There's our grass, that's okay. We go back to the rock. Maybe what I'll do is adjust this a little bit more, clamp it a bit more, or play around with the bias to kind of shift those colors a bit more. So it's really just at this point up to playing around with it, previewing it and seeing what looks good when it's kind of combined like this. And then after a little bit of adjustment, you'll find something that works quite well. So I'll take a look and see what I can do to adjust those to give a little bit better result. But we're keeping this fairly simple for now. But it does still have this very kind of contrasty feel. And to solve that, we could adjust our sat maps and how we're blending things. But one thing that might help get a little bit of extra detail in here is to use something to just break up everything overall and soften it up a bit. And to do this, I like using a rock map. So I can go here to our node network, and after erosion here, we're going to add one more node from data, I believe, rock map. And if we connect that to erosion, it's just going to create these little rock structures for the whole terrain. If we preview it by pressing F, it creates a bunch of these little rocky structures and shapes. And we'll adjust the coverage a bit, maybe 25% coverage. Density, maybe pull that down a bit so we get some nice contrast. And the idea is maybe negative 20%. Maybe add log to it to make it a bit stronger in these flat areas, but still have it on the mountains. And by doing this, we can also take a effects node. So I'm going to go here and grab, where is it? There it is, effects under adjustments. And we're just going to add some subtle noise and breakup. So I'll take my erosion, run it through effects. If we preview that, it gives us pretty much our height map. But I'm going to go in here and equalize it and add also shaper. And then connect that to the mask of our rock map. Like that. If we preview our rock map now, okay, it makes these areas darker, so it's really only on the mountains, like this. And by doing that, I'll probably have to adjust that shaper a little bit, not 0, maybe negative 30. I really want to round out those lower areas. maybe negative 35%. That's good. So it's just affecting more the mountain areas. And I'll use that rock map now and connect it to a sat map to give color to it. And then we'll add that kind of on top of everything. So I'm going to go in here to sat map, connect our rock map up to it, preview it, maybe go back to rocky here, choose something that's fairly high contrast. I think there's some really, like something like this is good. And maybe I'll have to adjust that a little bit. I'm just going to go in here and bring that up to give us some nice grading or coloring. And this will kind of soften everything the way that I'm going to add it. So let's see if we reverse this, what it looks like. Okay, maybe that works a bit better. Input clarity, why not? Post-processing. I try not to adjust these too much, but I think in this case might help making it a bit darker and a bit more desaturated. So that's desaturated and then darker. How does it look darker? Okay, maybe brighter. Yeah, that's not bad. So I'll try something like that, and I'll take this and then combine it. So we have our other combine up here, which is our current kind of coloring for our landscape. And then we'll add another combine. And combine what we had before with what we have now, this new sat map. And what we'll end up doing is we could use a mask. So what I'll end up doing is maybe just previewing this at first. I'll press F to view it. Maybe not blend. Maybe we'll do something like a screen. Okay. Maybe a higher percentage. Okay, that's not bad. And then maybe what we'll do is we'll use our rock map. Since our rock map has all these lower areas, dark, it's only going to affect the mountains. So I could use that rock map as the mask as well for this combine. And what this is going to do is leave these lower areas as our kind of grass coloring. And then the higher mountains is just going to help soften those details out a bit. So this is before and now after. And if we look at an area like this, before, after, kind of adds a bit of extra detail, pulls away some of that kind of high contrast feel, and just adds a little bit more structure and detail to it. So it doesn't feel like these areas are just flat color. It adds a little bit of breakup into them, and I think it helps. So even if we look at these areas here, before, after, and maybe we'll go to 4K resolution and really see what the effect of that is. So maybe what I'll do is view a section like this, and see, that's good, and go to 4K, and I'll let that just generate. So here it is in 4K, and if you're wondering how long that actually took, you can always go up here to these little 3 lines and go to statistics, and you'll get a window that shows, hey, total build time took 2 minutes, 48 seconds, and this is how much cache size it's using up, and how many nodes you have here, erosion, look dev nodes, adjustments, how many nodes in total. So kind of nice that you're able to see what nodes are taking long for if you want to later on kind of go back and maybe remove some of these nodes that we don't really need. I don't know if all these are necessary for what we're creating here. I'm just creating this and going through the thought process that I kind of do when I make a terrain. So not all this is optimal. You could probably cut this down a lot and make it much better. But adding that rock map on top of the combine, if we look at the difference, even on these other areas, this is before and this is after. I think it just helps blend things a little bit together and just makes it look overall a little bit better. But most of this is probably not needed because we're going to be retexturing this thing anyways in Unreal. But I want to make sure that we have something that is presentable and that works in Gaea for if we have to make more terrains or adjustments later, we have stuff that has all the detail that we need to extract from. So this is not too bad. I could probably call it done here and export our height map and go from there. But it still feels a little bit like it's lacking some details. So I'm probably going to add a little bit more to this, and doing that, I'm going to add a bit of kind of like soil flows down the mountains or something. So maybe what we'll do is we'll add a soil node. So under data, soil, I'm going to drag one of those in, just connect it up to erosion, and then connect that soil node up to a sat map. And for the settings for soil, I'll leave it as default, just turn on graded to help it be a little bit more contrasted. And then for the sat map, I'm not going to be picky. I'm just going to go through here and look at something that kind of looks like kind of sand or soil or dirt. So just kind of cruising through here, maybe rocky. Let's see, these are all too saturated. 300. Oh, these aren't bad. Maybe this one. And I'll press F to preview that. This is now 4K, so it's going to take a little while to generate. So I'll pause this and then we'll take a look at it once it's generated. Okay, so here it is. So not bad. Maybe I'll play around with the bias a bit and just pull it down to shift that gradient a little bit to get a bit better looking soil flows. And then once I have something like that, I'm going to blend it on top of our resulting terrain. And the way I'm going to use to blend it is use velocity from data. And that will give me some nice streams or flow looking like details. So if I preview velocity, we can change some of the settings here, like duration out need to be 40, maybe 20. Rain, maybe 50. Reach low, reach high. I could adjust some of these. But I'm just going to try that and see what it generates. So it's generating, and then we'll take a look. Maybe we'll have to add more contrast to it or something. Let's see what it gives us. Okay, so that's some nice breakup. Maybe we'll do a equalize on that to make it even stronger, more noticeable, like that. And we could adjust this a bit more, but I think that'll be okay. And what we'll end up doing is taking that velocity node and using it as a mask and blending it with our soil. So we'll take another combine here. So I'm just going to go up here to combine what we had before with this soil, with this as the mask. Combine type, maybe blend, but very subtle, maybe 30%. And take a look at what that does. So preview that combine as our new map to view on top of everything. That's not too bad. It adds this kind of soily flow everywhere. Maybe the grass that I have, the sat map for that I could adjust. I'm getting some weird artifacts here, so we could do some adjustments of that. But this is not too bad. And I've made a bit of a mess of this graph. It's probably a bit more than we really need. And we can go back and adjust things and probably make it better. But I'm going to add one more layer of detail. And this is something that sometimes I'll do if I want it to have just a bit more detail. Add a texture node, add a sat map on top of that, and not really worry about it too much. And I'll connect the texture node to our erosion again. Maybe I'll place it over here. Connect our sat map node to our texture node. And for the sat map, what I'll end up doing is, again, just choosing something, but this time high contrast. Keep it kind of more grayscale, because what I'm going to end up doing is multiplying this on top. So it'll either darken or brighten things. So maybe something like this 378 under Rocky. If I preview that, it's going to be mostly gray values. And I'll probably have to reverse it and maybe shift its bias a bit. I'm just going to do it right away because I probably know that I'll have to do that. So I'll reverse it and maybe set the bias to negative 50% or something, and maybe also improve clarity. So something very high contrast like this that highlights a lot of details. And then what I'm going to end up doing is taking that, maybe I can even go here and do output clarity as well, just to really kind of contrast it. And I'll be multiplying that on top of what we had before. So again, just use a combine. And this is excessive. This will make things a little bit slow. Probably better ways of doing this, but I'll combine that on top. Set it to multiply. 50% is okay, and maybe use our texture as a mask. And preview that by pressing F. And that kind of gives us our end result. So what that's kind of doing is before, it's like this. After, it's just making it a bit darker, adding some more crevices, rocky structures, giving us something that maybe just helps it look a little bit more detailed and highlights some areas. So this is kind of what we end up with. And again, we'll have to do some final adjustments to this, but it's not too bad. And we can change the lighting or see how it looks with different lighting in here, just to see if that's all reading correctly with different types of lighting, more sunset lighting or top-down lighting. So after doing a final check and making sure everything is how you want it to look like when you export it, we can start renaming some of our nodes just to make it a bit more clear if we were to look at this graph at another point in time. So maybe my last combine node here, I'll rename it as export color. And then what I'll also do to export the height map for this terrain, the map that determines what heights all these different areas are, to do that, I'm going to use the erosion because that's the last node where we define the height. And we are going to create an output node. So I'm going to go on over here to, I believe it's under output here, and just drag an output node and connect my erosion up to that output node. And I'll set it to output as raw 16-bit and the R16 option here. And I think that option works best for Unreal. And then what I'll do is I'll mark this for export. So I'll take this output node, press F3, or you can also right click and mark for export. And I'll do the same thing with my final combine here for the color, F3 to mark for export. And then we'll also create a node to give us a bunch of masks. So what I'm also going to do in addition to marking both those for export, I'll also create a RGB mix here from the color section. And this will take 3 colors, red, green, blue, and I'm going to populate those 3 colors with different masks. So we can use that to isolate different areas in Unreal. And we might have to come back and export some other masks as well, but maybe we can start off with something. So I'll take the red channel of that RGB mix and maybe connect it to my slope here that I have connected to the erosion. And then I'm also going to connect the green channel here to maybe our effects node here that we use to mask out some more kind of mountainous or higher areas. And then I'll use the blue to maybe mask out the velocity. And now if I were to press just F to take a look at what this mask is going to produce, I'll just zoom out here, it gives us a mask of green for mountains, red for kind of all these other areas, and then blue for some of these slopes here. So it gives us a nice way of masking different features of our terrain. And we can use each one of those red, green, blue channels as masks in Unreal to scatter different or to populate different textures like grass, rock, or sand or something, whatever we're wanting to kind of use for the terrain coloring. And we can export more masks, but that's just an example of how you can use these RGB mix nodes to produce a red, green, and blue mask of your terrains. And now I'll mark this for export as well. So F3, or again, right click and mark for export. And now if I go over here to build, I'll see I have my RGB mix. I'll save it as a PNG 8 for Unreal. Export color, PNG 8, and then output will output as that R16 or raw 16-bit file format. Resolution for a height map. So for Unreal, it's a little bit different. Your height map will have to be the Unreal presets here. So if I'm going to do a 2K height map, it'll be 2017. And that's more of just a Unreal thing. So it has a kind of preset section here for Unreal. So we'll do 2017. We'll leave the range as raw and color space is sRGB. We can adjust these and get different kind of ways of exporting our height to different softwares, but we're not going to worry about it too much. I'll maybe talk about that a bit later, but for us, we're just going to eyeball it and make it look as best as we can and not overcomplicate things. So we'll leave that as raw, and then we can click Start Build and let this export at 2017 resolution. Now, once that's exported, one thing you have to be careful of is since we exported this all to 2017 resolution, that's good for Unreal for our height map, our output here. That's going to be our height map that we're going to load into Unreal. But for our RGB mix and for our export color, that's going to be a little bit problematic because if it's 2017 resolution, that's not really divisible or not really a power of 2. Which means that if we were to use that resolution for our mask for these different parts of our terrain, we're not going to get MIP maps or LODs, levels of detail, where the texture resolution could be cut in half or lowered if you're further away from an area. So you might actually want to keep this output.r16, our height map, but then delete this RGB mix and this export color and re-export them as 2048 by 2048 resolution. It doesn't matter too much. Like you can still use a 2017 resolution one, but again, you won't get MIP maps or levels of detail in Unreal. So you probably want to export those out as 2048 by 2048, or if you want them to be higher quality, because maybe you want more details in it, something that could also be justifiable is your height map might be 2048 resolution, but maybe your color map or your map that you're using for masks for your textures here for different features of the terrain, those could be 4K or something, 4096 pixels by 4096 pixels. So it really depends. And you have to remember that when you export your height map to Unreal, higher resolutions will mean a larger landscape. You can always scale them back down in Unreal and whatnot, but just keep in mind, like, you might not need excessive resolutions. You don't need like a 16K landmass. Again, these height maps are not meant to capture every detail of your terrain. They're just the overall height, and then you'll be scattering trees, plants, rocks, additional assets on top of this terrain to detail it. Now we're going to open up Unreal, and I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to make it a game project, third person, so that we can run around our landscape once we create it. So we're going to use this third person template, and I'll specify where I want to save this project. I'm going to call it landscape here, just so we have some sort of project name, and then I'll create that. Now, once the project is created, we'll see something like this, which is the default kind of third person template. But what we're going to do is we're going to create a new map. So what we're going to do is go up here to File, New, and we're going to create a new level, and we're going to make it the basic level, just so it has nothing preloaded. And we're just starting from kind of like a clean scene or an empty scene, but we still have like the sky and some basic things in there. So we'll click create. And now we have our kind of basic scene and our player start section here. And we'll load in our height map. So I'm going to go here to selection mode, go to landscape. We'll load in our landscape. So we're going to import our landscape from file. We're going to select the height map now. So we're going to select that height map that we exported from Gaea, that R16 file. And once we select that file, it'll show us a little preview in here of a landscape. If you zoom really far out, you can see our landscape here. And we can just go fit to data if you want it to automatically adjust these settings to kind of fit whatever that file is describing, but usually it's already doing that anyways. And if we look at it, I'm just going to look at it from very far away view. It looks a little bit flat. It doesn't look as steep or as kind of high up and contrasted as it did in Gaea. And that's because our height is probably being read or imported a bit differently based on the size of this terrain. And there's ways that you can actually calculate this so it appears exactly the same in Unreal as it does in Gaea. But most of the time, it's probably more work to do that than just to eyeball it or guess. So what I'm going to do is just manually change this to something that I like. And again, this is up to you. You don't have to do it this way, but usually I find this a little bit easier. So maybe I'll set it to 250 or something for the Z scale, because then I'm starting to see that mountain there is starting to look kind of how it was in Gaea, fairly steep. Now, one thing you have to be careful too is this terrain now is way below the grid, like the 0, 0, 0 world space. So the problem with that is if your characters or something goes below a certain height, you'll automatically kill them and get rid of those objects. And you can change those settings over here under world settings. This kill Z. If anything's below that kind of location on Z axis, it'll just remove it from the scene. But also, I don't like having my terrain like negative 100,000 units below the origin. I usually like treating 0 as like water level or as the ocean level. So this is really far down below that. So I'm going to have to also offset this. So the center of the world is kind of where this is. That's kind of at the 0, 0 space and 0 space in Z. It's not below the grid or axis, this little kind of block of terrain here, block of checkerboard cube type object. So I want to move my terrain up to that point. And the best way to do that is probably just change the location Z here. So I'm going to set it to maybe something like 50,000. And is that high enough? No, we're still below it for a lot of our landscape. So I'm going to set it to maybe 65,000. And that's above now. That's okay. So I'll leave it like that. And I'm just going to go import now. It's going to create the landscape properly. And there it is. You can always change the scale and positioning of the landscape after if you have to now. Like you can click here and still have access to the scale and location, but it's just easier to do that before it creates it like this and it becomes more heavy. So there's our landscape that we had in Gaea, but now in Unreal. And we'll leave landscape mode for now. And we're going to take our player start. That's where our player will spawn. And we'll move that and make sure it's above the terrain. And then if we were to click play, it'll spawn us as a character. And now we can run around our terrain that we exported as a Heightmap from Gaea and have successfully imported it into Unreal. Now it looks pretty good at this point. Like it's pretty cool. We have all these mountains and all this terrain, and it's a pretty large environment. But obviously the landscape lacks detail. There's no textures on it. There's no trees, there's no plants, there's no rocks, there's nothing. So that's something that we'll eventually be adding and taking a look at. But this kind of gives you a good starting point for being able to create some terrain in Gaea, export it as a height map, and bring it into Unreal and start getting it into some sort of form that you can run around with a character on. So we've started our very first kind of steps in creating a little bit of a outdoor environment or terrain in Unreal. If you've enjoyed this video, if you learned something new, don't forget to like and subscribe. Also comment down below on what other videos you'd like to see. And if you are part of the Patreon, which you can find a link to down in the description below, you'll get access to this PDF that goes over all the steps that we went over in this video in a little bit more detail. And you'll also get access to the actual Gaea file that makes up this terrain and also the exported height map files and textures.